Last week, I invited you to consider the idea that sometimes floats through our UU circles, that in addition to our 7 principles and our 6 sources that are printed on the back of your order of service, we should perhaps add a 7th source, our UU history and heritage. While continuing to seek wisdom wherever we can find it, from all the world's religions, from our own direct experience, from modern science, we should also recognize our homegrown history, heritage, and wisdom. The roots of our Unitarian half of our heritage go back more than 5 centuries to the 1500s in Europe, and our Universalist roots go back to the 1700s here in North America. Along these lines, last Sunday, we reflected on the life of that innovative minister-scientist, Joseph Priestley, who, in addition to discovering oxygen and inspiring the Jefferson Bible, helped spread Unitarianism in our region. Priestley died in 1804 at the age of 70, so he lived most of his life in the 18th century. So this week I'd like to shift our attention to the 19th century and one of the great Unitarians of that age, William Ellery Channing. Next week we'll shift our focus for quite a few weeks away from history, for any non-history buffs out there. And then in mid-March we'll revisit our UU history and heritage again briefly to look at the Transcendentalist revolt that came with Emerson and Parker and others in the 19th century. For now, let's turn our attention to what we might learn today from the life of William Ellery Channing. I first heard of Unitarian Universalism in college, and our UU student group was called the Channing Circle. But I had no idea who Channing was. Some of you may have had a similar response if you looked at that plaque outside of our chapel and noticed that we called our chapel the Channing Chapel. You may have thought, who was that guy? Well, now you'll know. Less transparently, some of our oldest, our largest, our most venerable UU congregations also owe their name to Channing. Have any of you ever been to an All Souls Unitarian congregation? Okay, a few of you have. So there's All Souls Church Unitarian right here in DC, and All Souls, the Unitarian Church of All Souls in New York City. Both of those have close to 1,000 members, as well as the 1,800 All Souls Unitarian in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So the largest Unitarian congregation in the world is in Tulsa, Oklahoma, of all places. And so all 3 of those All Souls UU congregations owe their name to a famous passage in which Channing said, "I am a living member of the great family of all souls. And I cannot improve or suffer myself without diffusing good or evil around me through an ever-enlarging sphere." He felt himself deeply connected to all souls. Now that sounds a lot like a 19th century version of Dr. King's famous quote that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, that we are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny, and whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Or the words of our 7th principle, that we are part of an interdependent web of all existence. What Channing meant and what inspired those UU congregations to take on that name, All Souls, is that all of us, despite all our diversity, are part of the same human family. Here in the 21st century, some would extend that sense of family and interdependence even beyond human beings to all beings. Accordingly, how we treat ourselves and others matters because the effects ripple out, either increasing or decreasing the amount of compassion and cruelty in the world. Choosing kindness matters. Again, in Channing's words, I cannot improve myself or suffer myself, what the Buddha say, create suffering for myself and those around me, without diffusing good or evil around me through an ever-enlarging sphere. To begin to tell you a little bit more about the author of that phrase, I am a living member of the great family of all souls and the namesake of our UUCF chapel, William Ellery Channing was born in 1780 and he died at the age of 62 in 1842. To set him in context, keep in mind that Ralph Waldo Emerson's breakout book Nature was published in 1836. So Emerson was launching his career almost at the end of Channing's life. And Channing loomed large when Emerson was coming into his own. Emerson called him our bishop, and that's no small thing with institutionally skeptical Unitarians. Emerson wrote further that Dr. Channing, whilst he lived, was the star of the American church. And we thought then, if we do not still think, that he left no successor in the pulpit. Now, that's a slightly complicated claim, of course, because Emerson, of course, left his Unitarian pulpit, so he didn't have to compete with Channing. And one among many reasons that Channing continues to be an important figure for us to consider today is that whereas, again, Emerson left his Unitarian pulpit after only a short time for the lecture circuit, and whereas some of his fellow Transcendentalist ministers like George Ripley left to try like utopian experiments like Brook Farms. We'll look at them some more in March. Channing stayed. He stayed almost 4 decades in the Unitarian pulpit that he served. Federal Street Church in Boston, now known as the Arlington Street Church. He committed to the stability of spending a long time in one good place. He was 23 when Federal Street were named and installed him, and he stayed until his death. If you're interested in learning more about Channing, perhaps the best starting place is a biography written by Jack Mendelson, one of Channing's mid-20th century successors in our Arlington Street pulpit. Mendelson subtitled his biography of Channing, "The Reluctant Radical," because unlike the more naturally radical Theodore Parker, whom we'll get to in March, Channing's inclinations were to moderation. So starting in 1831 and for the next and final decade of his life, that's what it took him to finally get around to speaking out against slavery, though that was 2 decades before the Civil War. And he continued to hope that we could end slavery in this country by choosing to do it, seeing it was the right thing. So he was advocating the moderate way, whereas others thought, no, it will come to violence. And although Channing is not always remembered today, Mendelson writes that in 1880, the 100th anniversary of Channing's birth, elaborate public celebrations sprang up throughout the United States, Great Britain, Ireland, Europe. He was known throughout the United States and Europe. Enthusiastic tributes flowed from Asia. The minister at the time of the Unitarian Church of All Souls in New York City said, "Of Channing, we do not say that he was, because he still is. He is a burning and shining light, and the season has not even reached its meridian when the church and the world are willing to rejoice in his light." So who was that guy that we named our Channing? He was a huge deal in the 19th century. And perhaps surprisingly, given his influence, Channing stood only 5 feet tall, he weighed only 100 pounds, and he was sickly and weak most of his life. Along these lines, I mentioned last week that one of the powerful recurring themes that you see over and over in UU history is of individuals studying religious scriptures for themselves and choosing to honor the truth of their reason and their experience and liberating themselves from oppressive religious traditions. Channing was certainly an example of that, but he was also an example of another disturbing trend in our history. Both Channing and Parker are 2 examples of our religious leaders who ruined their health through overwork. Channing had an almost monk-like ascetic side and pushed himself far too hard as a young minister. He would regularly stay up for hours past midnight, reading by candlelight. He often slept on the hard floor without blankets. He had a bed to sleep in, but he was trying to build up his moral fiber. He did not eat enough, leaving himself frequently malnourished. Using today's medical insights, one educated guess is that Channing was sickly for the rest of his life. It wasn't the case in his childhood, but he became sickly for the rest of his life because the anxiety, the stress, the exhaustion took a terrible toll on his adrenal glands, weakening his body permanently for the rest of his life. The cautionary tale here is similar to my New Year's sermon in January when we looked at Ariana Huffington's wake-up call when she passed out, hit her cheek on the desk, and had a bunch of medical tests, and they said the only thing wrong with you is that you're sleep deprived. And that was a huge wake-up call for her, passing out from overwork. Being famous and successful, or having the potential to be, will not protect you from neglecting self-care, just as Channing didn't need to die at too young an age of 62. Eating well, exercising, meditating, getting adequate rest and vacation is vitally important for all of us. We're now a month into the new year. How are you doing with any resolutions that you made? Perhaps Channing's story can be an opportunity to take stock of how is 2015 going for you? Is it a year in which you're thriving? Is it a year of well-being? What intentions may you want to set to give yourself permission to take care of yourself for the long run? Another reason I wanted to share with you some about Channing is that we're rapidly approaching May 15th, 2019, and you're going to start hearing a lot about Channing, and I don't want you to say, who was that guy? Why are they making this big deal about him? May 5th, 2019 will be the 200th anniversary of Channing delivering what is arguably the most significant, well-known, and influential sermon in Unitarian history. A sermon that he delivered at the ordination of the new minister of a congregation we now know today as First Unitarian Church in Baltimore. So perhaps in addition to planning a pilgrimage to tour Joseph Priestley's house, that's about 2.5 hours away in Northumberland, Pennsylvania, maybe we'll set that up for the fall. I also want to increase our awareness about the significance of Channing's Baltimore sermon as we approach the 200th anniversary. And our Baltimore congregation is already buzzing, already thinking, what do we need to do to celebrate? So events are beginning to be planned for that commemoration. You can also get ready for 2020, which will be the 250th anniversary of John Murray's first Universalist sermon, delivered on, of all places, the Jersey Shore. Returning to our focus for today, I mentioned earlier that our Unitarian roots go back to the 1500s in Europe, but it's important not to project our contemporary UU values onto our ancestors. The implications of anti-Trinitarianism and religious liberalism evolved over time, and it took centuries for us to reach the robust religious pluralism that we enjoy today. But reflecting on our history can make us grateful that we stand on the shoulders of giants. It can also potentially inspire us to be intentional about the ways right here in Frederick. How are we shaping the legacy of Unitarian Universalism that all these children here today and for us, that we're going to hand on to future generations? For an example from our past, although some of our ancestors as early as Faustus Socinus in the 1500s and Joseph Priestley in the 1700s did teach that Jesus was fully human, just like the rest of us. Many others of our ancestors, including William Ellery Channing, while rejecting the Trinity as irrational and unscriptural, still continue to think of Jesus and Christianity as unique, as special, as superior. Consider this passage from Channing. Jesus Christ is more than a man, existed before the world, literally came from heaven to save our race, still acts for our benefit, and is our intercessor to the Father. Moreover, in the early 19th century, Unitarian was not a name that our ancestors claimed. They still saw themselves basically as open-minded Congregationalist Christians. Unitarian was at the time often a negative epithet that the Orthodox Calvinist Christians called the liberals. So they'd say, you're Unitarians, because they thought the most interesting thing about them and the most terrible thing about them was that they rejected the Trinity. But for our ancestors, what was most important was not rejecting the Trinity, it was teaching that the divine is love, as opposed to the Orthodox Calvinist God of fear and judgment. To them, what was most important was teaching that human beings have free will and that we have a tremendous potential for good, as opposed to the Calvinist doctrines of original sin and predestination. And emulating Jesus' teachings and ethics was central for them, as opposed to fixating on what people believe about Jesus. Channing's desire was for this theologically liberal perspective to be viewed as a mainstream way of being Christian in the modern world. But starting in 1805, the public controversy started heating up between the Orthodox Calvinists and between the liberal Congregationalists. So when Channing was invited in 1819 to deliver this sermon in Baltimore for the ordination of their new minister, he took the bold step forward of claiming Unitarian, that pejorative that his critics were hurling at him, and he said, fine, we're Unitarians, and here's what we mean by it. He claimed it on his own terms. That famous sermon was called Unitarian Christianity, and to give you a point of comparison, my sermons are generally about 2,000 words, about 20 minutes. Channing's Unitarian Christianity was 7 times longer. It was 14,000 words and took about an hour and a half to deliver, but they didn't have cable and internet and TV, so there was less competition. Channing's Baltimore sermon became a sensation. It was quickly published, and no pamphlet save Thomas Paine's Common Sense had ever before circulated so widely in this country. Keep in mind that the year was 1819, so this is almost 200 years ago, decades before the Civil War, decades before Darwin published On the Origins of the Species, and Channing was unabashedly asserting that the Bible is a book written for humans, in the language of humans, and its meaning should be sought in the same manner as other books. That Baltimore sermon helped galvanize theologically liberal ministers, a process that continued 6 years later to 1825, when a gathering of like-minded ministers, they gathered in the basement of Channing's Arlington Street, Federal Street Church then, and they founded the American Unitarian Association, claiming that name Unitarian at an organizational level. So why Unitarianism? Because in 1819, Channing preached a sermon called Unitarian Christianity, claiming that name, and then leading to the founding of the AUA, that then merged with the Universalist Church of America in 1961 to give us Unitarian Universalism. And as we continue to reflect on Channing's legacy for us today, a legacy of beginning to organize around that name Unitarian, a legacy of the consequences of overwork and the importance of self-care, a legacy of remembering that we are each a living member of the great family of all souls. I invite you to hear once more a version of those famous words that you heard earlier as the spoken meditation, that Channing spoke in 1837 before the Sunday School Society about his vision for religious education, one of the foundational reasons we exist as a congregation. I've adapted Channing's vision for us today. In our life together as a religious community, may your mind be stirred up. We don't want you to check your brain at the door of the church. We want your mind to be stirred up here, quickened and strengthened with the power of thought. May you learn to trust what you see. Don't just believe secondhand what other people tell you needs to be the case. May you learn to trust what you see when you look at the world inquiringly and steadily with your own eyes. May you be inspired with a fervent love of truth. May you find time and space for stillness that you might look inside yourself and touch inward springs. May your conscience, your moral discernment be awakened, that you might look with impartial, conscientious judgment at whatever subjects are offered for your attention. And may you be courageous enough to stand up when that still, small voice of your conscience tugs at you that this is wrong and that it doesn't have to be this way. And may your soul be woken up, that together we might cherish an authentic spiritual life. May it be so for us and for future generations. I invite you to take a moment of silence to reflect on those words and the ways that Channing's legacy continues to reverberate for today to your life and the life of the world. In a few moments, we'll have some time to share together.